Welcome to the journey of an aesthete, a comprehensive examination of all things aesthetic, the arts, the humanities, and what it means to be human. Hello, is Elizabeth Anderson there?
Yes, speaking.
Elizabeth Anderson, welcome to our podcast, Journey of an Aesthete.
Yeah, I'm very pleased to talk with you.
I'm excited too. I usually do a little introduction if you don't mind, so I'm going to do that now and introduce you. I'm from time to time on our show, we have, serious, philosophers and thinkers and intellectuals. We had George Kateb on our show last year, and that was really enjoyable because I get to sort of nerd out on certain topics that I normally don't always get to talk about with all of our guests. But you're such an important thinker. I don't think I could overestimate your importance. You've done research on ethics and politics and political philosophy and the issues of justice and democracy and government and issues of integration and race. You've written about so many topics. I hope we can get to at least some of those on the show. I don't think
Absolutely,
I don't think we can exhaust all of them, is what I mean, because you've been so prolific. And so welcome to our show. And usually we do a sort of a linear chronology, which is a fancy way of saying personal biography. In your case, you have roots in John Rawls, the great John Rawls. So of course I have to ask about Rawls, but if you want to talk about anything earlier than that, or how you came to philosophy or science, philosophy of science, or any of it, start wherever you want to and begin. Start us off.
Sure, yeah. Well, I'll start actually earlier because in high school, my father actually inspired me with the study of philosophy.
Okay.
So he was an aeronautical engineer, working in the, at the heyday of the space program.
Wow.
But he, having had technical training, as an engineer, he kind of missed out on the liberal arts, but I was always a bookworm.
Mm-hmm.
And so in high school, he sat me down and we read some of Plato's Republic and John Stuart Mill together.
Oh, wow.
And those are some of my fondest memories. They were really inspiring. It was just really exciting to read those texts.
Yeah.
And he was also, I grew up in a pretty hardcore libertarian household under my father's influence. So, he had books like, Capitalism and Freedom by Milton Friedman. And
I bet he had
by Friedrich Hayek.
Road to Serfdom, I'm guessing, right? Road to Serfdom.
Yes.
You have that, yeah.
Yes, and the Constitution of Liberty.
Mm-hmm.
And so I poked around in those texts and got interested in economics.
Mm-hmm.
And when I went to Swarthmore College as an undergraduate, I was originally interested in majoring in economics and was taking courses in economics.
Mm-hmm.
But I also had some problems with the conceptual apparatus of economics.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that the concept of preference was being used too loosely on the assumption that if you choose something, that must mean because you want it, and that must mean that you think that it's in your self-interest. And I was thinking, well, a lot of reasons why people choose stuff isn't because it's in their self-interest, but maybe, they're just conforming to certain social norms or expectations of other people.
Yeah.
And it's precisely that kind of inclination to draw conceptual distinctions that kind of leads you to philosophy.
Okay.
And so that was one of the motives I had for moving into philosophy, but still with a very deep engagement with the social sciences.
Yeah.
And that was something that I continued in my undergraduate education, studying economics and social theory along with philosophy. And another really important influence that I had as an undergraduate was studying the history and philosophy of science with a wonderful philosopher, Hugh Lacey,
who
taught this seminar where we combined the history and the philosophy of science. And this was just completely eye-opening and incredibly exciting, because what we were learning was that the way philosophers of science were looking at science was through philosophical problems as they arose in the actual practice of science.
Uh-huh.
And I found this to be an incredibly exciting idea. And I thought, well, maybe we should think of doing moral and political philosophy from that perspective, rather than thinking that, oh, you can just do conceptual analysis or completely abstract arguments of a universal nature that apply regardless of whatever practical problems are in front of you. Why don't we think of doing moral and political philosophy
the same way,
starting from the problems that people actually experience in their lives? And that is really the essence of a pragmatist approach, and also a feminist approach, frankly, to philosophy, is that you start theorizing from the actual problems that people experience in their lives, and think about how those problems could be articulated and worked out in practice, rather than thinking, oh, I can just sort of think a priori without any prior assumptions and come up with universal principles and apply them, afterwards.
Do you mind holding that thought? Because I got bitten by the bug, I guess when I read John Dewey a long time ago. For me, it was John Dewey and William James. And then Isaiah Berlin, of all people. Of course, that's a slightly different, but I sort of realized that pluralism was more true than the alternatives. It occurred to me, than monistic theories. And I think you came to that. It's interesting. For me, I felt like there was a one-size-fits-all quality to these commandments from above, too abstract. And I always felt that there was not to put too fine a point on it, that there was almost a totalitarian temptation that can come out of that way of thinking from so abstractly and top down.
That was exactly what Bernard Williams thought.
I love Bernard Williams.
In his famous essay, Morality, the Peculiar Institution, right?
Yeah, it's a great essay.
It's all, right, in comparison with slavery, right?
Yeah,
all of these demands that are being placed on us a priori and universally. He really objected to that, although I actually disagree with Williams. I do think that the concept of moral obligation is absolutely fundamental and central to the moral life, although I would agree with him that this urge to seek a universal principle that applies absolutely everywhere in all contexts can lead in a kind of totalitarian direction, and I don't really want to go there.
Right. Well, I'm interested in that question because I think Bernard Williams has been misread by many people as an amoralist or someone who's indifferent to those considerations. You wouldn't say that he was. I don't think he was indifferent. I think he just, or maybe maybe talk a little bit about that. In terms of Williams, was he misread, or was he partly?
Well, I think he was definitely a moralist in the sense that he admired, say, ancient Greek thought about the good life. But I think he was pretty skeptical of the idea of duties and obligations, the moral right and wrong, as central to the ethical life. And I actually think they are very, very central
to the
central,
ethical life. Sure, of course.
So that's a point at which I disagree with him. I don't think we can do ethics solely with the concept of the good life.
Right. So I guess the pragmatist conception is sort of revolutionary, right? Because it starts from where people live, if I understand what you're saying. But I guess I'm a little bit confused only because I'm trying to locate where John Rawls fits in, because John Rawls is such a major figure, and I'm sure he influenced you to some degree, as much as
absolutely,
much as Dewey. So
I went on to grad school. precisely to study with Rawls.
Oh, wow.
And that was at the advice of another wonderful professor I had at Swarthmore, Hans Oberdiek, who told me, you got to study with Rawls.
Wow. What year was that?
And so I did. And so Rawls actually did have important, very, very important pragmatist elements in his philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
So he did limit the scope of his theory of justice to, our current, societies, democratic societies with an advanced, economic structure.
Mm.
He was very hesitant to theorize beyond the scope of such societies. And it's not that he didn't think that, obviously there is justice.
Mm-hmm.
There are demands of justice in other societies, but he was hesitant to say what they would be because that wasn't the context that if you really are a pragmatist, then you're reluctant to draw generalizations beyond the scope of experience that you're familiar with.
Yeah, I like that, though. I mean, I think if you start from your own experience, that could be a guide to things in the future that you have not yet experienced, right? But you want to be cautious about it, I guess. In other words, you want to start from. In other words, you don't want to. I guess I would say is that people too often disparage their own experience.
Yes. Mm-hmm. I think that's right. And here's an important point, though, is that many people see pragmatism as a kind of moral relativism, like whatever any society thinks is right. Nope. But in fact, it's very different because within a pragmatist perspective, there's a fundamental recognition that every society is riven with contradictions and conflicts. Like no society has solved all of the problems that it faces.
Nope.
And so there's always internal critique. Mm-hmm. There's always resources that we need to take advantage of in order to come to terms with the unresolved problems that any given society faces. And that creates a kind of inherent dynamism in any given social formation.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, there is this, I'm glad you bring that up because pragmatism is not relativism at all. And I'm glad that you mentioned that not to confuse the two.
But what it does respect, though, is that different societies have different experiences and have faced different problems, and that can lead people to come to different sort of temporary settlements. Right. And we're not really in a position to just say, well, because they don't agree with us, they must be wrong.
Right.
We have to appreciate where they're coming from and why they have arrived at certain way stations, you might say, without any clear notion of any like firm or unique destination.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting. I saw a video of you talking about the need for dialogue, about talking. And I was struck by how some of the people representing, I guess, the far left were very hard on you and very hard. I think one of them was very suspicious of Dewey and I think said, well, it's all about power and why should we talk to these people? They're the enemy. And
but this is exactly if you think that way, then democracy's over.
Interesting.
And let's keep in mind that that's the way a lot of the panicky right thinks about the left.
Yeah. Oh, sure. Yeah.
And it's precisely that, the sense that our fellow citizens pose an existential threat to us that leads people away from democratic practice and towards various forms of authoritarianism. Mm-hmm. It's that fear that if we don't put a stop to the other side now, all will be lost.
Yeah.
And that's what it's just highly destructive of democratic politics and in those in the lecture that you heard, or it might have been a series because I've given this in various venues. This talk. What I stress is we got to be calm and ramp down the hysteria in order to get constructive democratic politics working.
Sure. I mean, I was struck by, I think, again, I think that's a misuse of ideas. I think in their case, they were misusing Michel Foucault, who is actually a very deep and interesting thinker, but I think some misuse him for their own purposes, either misuse him to say, let's have no dialogue, or let's shut down discussion, or, that's a very, you're right. You can't have democracy if you entertain that. I didn't want to get too far away from Rawls. What was Rawls like as a teacher, as a man, or he strikes me as a really unusual person, very special person. Do you have any thoughts about him?
It's really interesting. I'll tell you a couple of stories about him. Naturally, of course, his graduate seminars were very, very full, not just with his graduate students, but visiting scholars would also be in the room.
Yeah.
And I remember one time in one of his seminars that I was attending, I showed up really early, and there was just one other person.
That's beautiful.
In the room at the time who was a visiting scholar, I think maybe from Germany. I don't recall exactly who it was.
Mm-hmm.
But he looked at me and he said, with puzzlement, in this seminar, everyone is very polite and civil to each other. With surprise. He said that with surprise.
Huh. Wow.
And of course, that was the tone that Rawls always set. Real dialogue.
Yeah.
Real conversation. This isn't about debate, scoring points against each other, or who can top who. It was about serious thinking and trying to work through problems together, thinking together. It's a very democratic and pragmatic spirit.
Absolutely.
To the tone that he set. And that was something that I really, really respected and loved about Rawls' seminars. And indeed, he was the most modest of any highly accomplished philosopher I have ever met. Mm-hmm. So when grad students would criticize him, he never once ever said, "Oh, you misread me."
Right.
He would always say, "I must not have expressed myself very clearly."
Yeah.
And then he would explain what he was up to. He was always like that, incredibly modest, never arrogant.
No. Well, that's why I asked about him as a man. He seemed really had a lot of integrity. He seemed to me, and he, and that's the sense I get from listening to his lectures, and so I'm right about that. Right, he had good character.
Yes.
Yeah, I guess you would say.
I think that's right, and he really manifested that in his teaching. The other thing is he gave his graduate students real freedom in how to pursue their research and what topics to tackle, even though, of course, many people chose to write on Rawlsian themes.
Yes.
Many of his students did. He gave everyone complete freedom, intellectual freedom to choose what they want. So my dissertation wasn't really engaging Rawls's work at all. Even though, of course, I've been really importantly influenced by Rawls.
Yeah.
But he said, fine, go right ahead.
Well, was that, I have to ask, did your early work on value and the extrinsic and the intrinsic come out of that? Is that later, or was that?
That was my dissertation.
That was your dissertation.
I did radically rewrite my dissertation to turn it into a book when I was an assistant professor at University of Michigan.
I see.
But it was coming out of my dissertation, the value pluralism.
Do you mind discussing that for the audience a little bit? Because I think it's important, number one. And number two, I think, again, to clear up misunderstandings and also to clarify some definitions, because it's important. what you mean by extrinsic, intrinsic.
Yes, right, because I don't use them in the same way that many others do.
Right.
So on the view, I was very interested, and I still am, in advancing the idea of value pluralism.
Absolutely.
There's different kinds of values.
Absolutely.
It's not all on the same scale. It's not all one same thing. It's a very anti-reductionist view of values. And one way to begin motivating that is by starting with the thought that to be good is to be the proper object of a favorable attitude. But there are many favorable attitudes. So there's a difference between love and respect and admiration.
Yeah, there is.
Those are three different things. And we have many other positive attitudes too, like awe. And, you might associate the sublime with the awesome. Today we say it's awesome, but back in the 18th century, people called it sublime.
Yes.
At any rate, once we understand that even our whole emotional apparatus is highly differentiated, that gives us a starting point for thinking about how value is also is plural.
It's plural, yeah.
Yeah. And then the other really important point that I start my book, Value in Ethics and Economics, with is by pushing against the idea that the fundamental good thing is a state of affairs that we want or desire or like, some fact in the world. And what I argue is, no, the fundamental valuable things are people, not propositions, not state of affairs, or animals. Animals are,
absolutely.
People are the proper objects of love and respect. That's not a state of affairs. That's like a whole person. And similarly, we can adore our pets.
Absolutely.
And have all kinds of affection and attachment to them. So animals are also valuable. We can admire, glorious specimens of practically any species of animal. So all of these living things, have their own value because they are intrinsic value.
That's right.
Because they're the proper object of these favorable attitudes and not because they're useful. I mean, we might also, find people and animals and plants and so forth useful, but they have a value independent of that.
That's right.
And that's what I'm trying to, it's one of the themes that I'm getting at. And then I also talk about modes of valuing. So valuing isn't just a matter of an immediate emotional response, but also whole patterns of conduct through which we express or manifest our favorable attitudes towards good things. And that can be culturally inflected in various ways. We have, for instance, norms of etiquette, which are fairly elaborate and culturally relative modes of expressing our respect for other people. And that leaves, that makes space open for cultural differentiation and elaboration over time.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I mean, the amount of societies are very complex, wouldn't you agree? And that has to be accounted for in some way. What do you attribute the popularity of not so good ideas like, say, consequentialism or this kind of abstraction? Why do you think that is so appealing? I mean, I'm thinking of the celebrity of Peter Singer. What do you attribute that to? It always puzzles me because I sort of think, well, is it the idea of starting from scratch or from above, or trying to create the perfect society, or trying to solve problems of injustice, or is that what it is? It's a
Well, I actually, believe it or not, my most recent research has located the origins of utilitarianism in Calvinism.
Oh, that's true. You have been studying that. Yeah, it's history of Christianity. Yeah.
And so basically, I'm writing. I just submitted a manuscript on the history of the work ethic, of the Protestant work ethic, to Cambridge University Press. I'm going to still have a lot of feedback and revision to do, but the first draft is written. And in that work, I go back to the Puritans who invented the work ethic and read a bunch of texts that Max Weber, in his classic, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, cited as the origins of the work ethic. And what I discovered there was that the Puritans, they basically all have a Calvinist theology.
That's interesting, yeah.
And there are certain characteristic aspects of the Puritan temperament which really have been carried forward in utilitarianism.
Yeah, that's
and one of them is like a kind of impatience with anything that doesn't have practical results. So within the Puritan ethic, this resulted in a transformation, even the whole idea of work. So in Catholicism, works were important, but in Catholicism, works are things like participating in the sacraments, prayer, doing the rosary. They're ritualistic.
They are, yeah.
And the Puritans just had complete contempt for that. They thought the only works that mattered was work. That is, things that had practical consequences for other human beings, that were carrying out God's will for human beings on earth, which is to help our fellow human beings, to promote their welfare. So here you have this kind of, and we see this also with Puritan churches. They're very stripped down.
Yeah, they
don't want all of this finery. They're not interested in aesthetics. What's the bottom line?
Well, you know,
my
podcast is called Journey of an Aesthete, after all. So this is probably a very important topic, because I'm often, you know, I don't have a lot of patience for some of the austerity of those doctrines, and certainly they don't. They certainly have. They don't like costume. They don't understand the importance of ornamentation, and it seems it's very bereft. But again, I want to beat up with it. Because as you point out, they got some things right. They weren't all wrong. But go ahead. I've talked too much. Go.
Yeah. So this is incredibly interesting, because Puritans were running a kind of class war against the high church Anglicans, who were basically allied with the aristocratic class,
the ruling class. The
ruling class.
That's the good part.
I mean, they're very materialistic. They're, and they want to show off their finery. And the Puritans just hated that. It's vanity.
Yeah.
And so and they also thought that Catholics were, with all of the, there was a lot of smoke and mirrors, mumbo jumbo, mystification. And they really thought that was befuddling people and bewitching them in certain ways. And so the stripping down was just, I think, part of a war against mystifications that they thought drew people away from real virtue.
Yeah.
But still, I'm with you. I mean, I do think that even though I'm not in any respect Catholic, the great, cathedrals of Europe are some of the most magnificent, gorgeous, beautiful works of art ever created.
Is it a case of a particular denomination carrying their ideas too far? Is this something that you see in history? Sort of, you have a good idea, but then you bang into the ground, or is that how you see that, as like and that's where we get conservative work ethic as opposed to a liberatory or progressive work ethic? Am I getting too far ahead? But
so I do think that the Puritans are reacting against real corruptions in the Catholic Church. and even among the high Anglicans too. So you can see, but I do think that's right, that there's also kind of a core of fanaticism. And we see this, that there's certain people who always want to drive a principle to its logical conclusion beyond all reason.
Yeah.
It does seem to be a kind of flaw that some people are inclined to. And a kind of rigorism that can shut out other domains of experience.
And so you see that as something that's an eternal problem, or is it a problem do you historicize that problem, or do you think, is it something in human nature, so-called human nature, or is it something that waxes and wanes? Or
I think that in any society, there is a range of what you might call personalities. And you can see different people, and I'm not going to use personality in any kind of sense that like is measured in psychological theory. I'm not thinking about it in that terms, but rather that in any society you can see a kind of a variety of dimensions of kind of orientation, where some people, for instance, just love the finery and the aesthetics, and others just are like really they only care about the bottom line.
Yeah, they only like facts
over frivolity, you know.
Right.
And there are many other dimensions of variation like that. So in any given society, you'll have some people who are just people of rectitude. They think there's a right and a wrong, and it's black and white.
Yeah.
And other people are looser and more open to a more kind of flexible way of dealing with problems rather than rigid roles. And you could just see that there's just these differences that maybe just come out of different people's temperaments.
They do. I do think so is really the imperative of being a democracy, making sure that everybody has a voice? Is it kind of solving that problem of these temperaments, and so that one voice doesn't get too loud or doesn't dominate too much? Would that be a
I think so. So here's another way to put the point. Within philosophy of science, there's a very interesting tradition which suggests that the positive features of science are not embodied in any single scientist, but rather arise from the community of scientists who are working together to hold each other to certain standards of research and so forth. And within that way, that more communal way of thinking about how science operates, it's very important that you do have a range of cognitive temperaments.
Yeah.
So you'll have some scientists who are really risk-taking, and they go out on a limb and they take some hypothesis that seems to have a low probability of success, but they really push it because every so often some of those just win big, like the $1 million lottery.
Yeah.
Right? So you want some cognitive risk takers, but you also want some more cautious, skeptical people who think, I don't really think that's going to fly. And then they will read the studies of the wild hypothesis and point out the flaws and demand additional experiments and so forth. But you need both kinds. You need both the adventurous people who go out on a limb and really explore new ideas that could really pay off big, but you also need the skeptical people so that we're not just gullible and swallowing the next bit of hype that sounds really cool. Well, and you can think of the same way in democracy, that we need a variety of temperaments, right? Some people pushing the envelope and others holding back a bit, more cautious about the risks. And democracy can be a way of kind of working out for society a kind of balance of those different
temperaments,
both to accommodate different people's comfort levels, but but also just to make sure that we're neither stagnant nor taking crazy risks.
Yeah, I mean, that brings you right up to date with your most recent work, right? Because you are dealing with oppressiveness at work and exploitation in the workplace, right? Most directly.
We've really gone overboard.
Oh, it's awful, but but your viewpoint is unique because you don't come at this from a doctrinaire Marxist perspective. But neither do you come at your research from a capitalist or free market purely perspective. Talk about where you locate yourself in that, or what you've discovered in your research and found. That interests me.
So this is really coming out of my pragmatism, is that there are lessons to be learned from history.
Yeah.
And I think what we're learning is the kind of hardcore neoliberal doctrine that we've been living with has some really, really bad consequences.
Yeah.
But of course, it doesn't mean that, comprehensive centralized planning of the economy is such a hot idea either, because that was also tried and failed.
Yeah.
And I think in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union and East European communism, almost all socialists came around to the thought, which I share, that in an advanced economy, you can't do without the extensive use of markets.
Yeah.
Markets are just really important. You can't eliminate them. And also that there's an important role for private property. Now, of course, how that's configured is an entirely separate issue. And so, on my view, the kind of big theory arguments between classical socialism and capitalism are entirely driven at a level of abstraction and generality that's not at all useful.
Yep. Absolutely.
And what I'm seeking is a much more fine-grained discussion of institutional design that really gets down to some, more just details about how you're going to spell out these different institutions.
Yeah. Get more. Do you talk a little bit more, if you don't mind, about some of those details, because it fascinates me. Because it seems to me when I look at the political landscape, I see abstract theorists duking it out and forming like cults around themselves and fighting, and it just seems really, it's very dismaying, I must say. And I feel like, what's the solution to that? Talk about that, where we can get into real practical solutions.
So I do think that we have to actually go back to the classical tradition of political economy.
Okay.
If you read and this is really one of the lessons that I want people to draw from my book on the work ethic, which is that the classical political economists, Smith, John Stuart Mill, people like that, both had very strong normative conceptions and very rich normative ideas about what a good, just system of organization would look like. But they're also very, very attuned to particulars of institutions, of human psychology, of the interaction of psychology and institutions, that is, how different institutions can help us cultivate better emotions and attitudes towards people, and what kinds of institutions make us hostile and distrustful of each other. And in fact, I think one of the most important normative lessons of the classical economists is that they understood that by far the most important product of an economic system is human beings themselves.
Wow.
The way we organize production and distribution profoundly affects our attitudes, emotions, feelings towards each other, our, whether we trust or distrust people, but also our skills, our dispositions. And in fact, one of the central themes of classical political economy is this deep concern shared by Smith, Marx, Mill, and many others.
Right.
That here we have a very sophisticated division of labor emerging in the Industrial Revolution, which gives us spectacularly advanced productive powers.
Mm-hmm.
So as a society, we're vastly richer. But as individuals, the workers are stunted, stultified, and bored, de-skilled, and reduced to repeating the same mechanical motion
over and over,
millions of times over the course of their working lives. And that's horrifying.
It is, yeah.
Imagine if you're just reduced to some mechanical motion, endlessly repeated for your entire life. It's boring. It drives people into distraction. It causes, they didn't have the term, but repetitive stress injury. It's bad for people's health. They understood that. For their minds, for their spirits, it just grinds people down. And what they were seeking, all of them, or what they wanted, was a society in which would both be prosperous, but also enhance and enrich the life and experience and the skills and abilities of each individual member of society. But that's about the impact on us as human beings and who we are. And also they sought a society in which the institutional arrangements would support mutual trust and sympathy with each other. That's a matter of the quality of our human relationships. None of them thought that the point of economics was just to accumulate a mountain of stuff or wealth. That was actually a secondary consideration. I mean, important, of course, at the time, given how widespread poverty was. But that was by no means like the fundamental thing that people should be after. None of them thought that.
Yeah, I know that you've rehabilitated John Locke and saved him from McPherson, right? Would that be a way of putting it, or?
Well, I mean, I think Locke is not at all a libertarian.
Nope.
He is a proponent of the work ethic, and a particularly progressive work ethic for the most part. That is a pro-worker work ethic. And that's what I argue. But he's not consistent. And in fact, the only totally consistent person in the book is Adam Smith. The others all are constantly slipping or occasionally slipping into a pretty reactionary version of the work ethic. But Smith was completely consistent throughout. He is a wonderful,
interesting,
humane philosopher and economist. He didn't think as far ahead in terms of institutional design as some of his successors. But the humanity is all there.
Everybody needs an anchor in life. You, me, just everybody. Anchor made this whole show possible. I'm immensely grateful to them. You too can use Anchor to make your own shows and create your own vision. Download the Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. So do you see this sort of the far left or Marxist revolution is in its own way a deviation from some originally good ideas or the classical, a deformation of the classical tradition, and that's what set Soviet Union and all these very bad governments on their course? Or how do you read that history?
So I think that Marx is subject to two different interpretations. And a lot of it is because Marx and Engels together really didn't spell out the institutional arrangements of communist society, right? Oh, we'll leave that to the revolutionaries, right? And I think that was a serious mistake. And so that left open possible articulations of Marxist theory, both in a totalitarian direction, but also in a very social democratic direction. And both of those articulations were actually taken by different historical actors growing out of the Marxist tradition.
So do you think the fact that Marx was purely diagnostic, or sort of I'm going to critique or understand capitalism, is both his virtue and his vice? The fact that he left things up to unpredictability of the future, or the fact
I guess what I think is that there are a couple of things. One is he just thought that it would be easy to devise comprehensive alternatives to the market. And he didn't really think through in any serious way what a huge challenge it is to replace the market with we'll just get people together, they'll all be reasonable and they'll agree to exchange this for that. Well, no, I'm sorry. This isn't how it works. So I think he was kind of delusional about that. And he was also, by the way, mistaken about, he thought that markets made people selfish and kind of rapacious towards each other. And I think actually empirically that turns out to be false. So there is some really wonderful work by some economists coming out of the radical political economy tradition, people like Sam Bowles and Herb Gintis, who have argued that empirically experiencing commercial society actually is good for building on trust. So if you look at, say, different people from different societies, with different extent of the market, the people in more extensive market societies are more likely to trust people in public goods games.
Interesting. That's really interesting.
Whereas if the scope of the market is much smaller, they're only going to trust their tiny little circle. Right. But markets get you used to the idea that, well, like I could just order this on Amazon from, some vendor in a distant country and it'll come to me. And it will. Right. So it actually expands the scope of trust.
So what you're saying is you make a distinction which Marxists fail to draw between neoliberal capitalism in a certain historical moment and markets. Those are different, right? Those are very different mechanisms.
Well, look, there's a whole market socialist tradition, which I think got a huge boost from the failure of the Soviet Union. And so, in the 1990s, like almost all socialist thought becomes market socialist. You need markets. And then the issue is, how do we organize production, which is an entirely separate question.
That's interesting.
And so in my book, Private Government, I point out that the corporation or the firm, the productive enterprise, has really been grossly under-theorized. Like we talk about market society, but really a major question left out when we talk about markets is, well, how are firms governed? Who governs them? Who calls the shots? And what is the constitution of the typical firm. And my argument is, if you actually examine that constitution, it's a dictatorship. Well, that isn't so great. I mean, if we don't think dictatorships are so great, in politics,
why would it be any better
for states?
Private?
Why should we be so happy with them for production? And I don't think we should be. That's a chief source of the oppression of workers.
Absolutely. So I guess that's why one of the things I like about your work, you're basically, your insight is a dictatorship is a dictatorship. If it looks like a duck and it's like dictatorship, things that are undemocratic are just that. They're anti-democratic, right? Would that be a fair way to?
I do think that we need more democracy in the workplace. Now, it's not going to look like conventional representative democracies, but we have to think clearly about and do a lot of experimentation of what that would look like for productive firms. But the key thing about democracy is that everybody's interests in a well-configured democracy get heard. Whereas, under a dictatorship, if you dissent, you get fired. Right? That's typically what happens. But that just means that the top dogs don't really have to listen.
What needs to be done to change all these things? It does seem kind of, one could be overwhelmed. Again, I'm an outsider. I'm certainly not an activist, and I'm not someone who, how does it look to you? Or again, I was very dismayed by the way people seem to relish war and as a way to solve things, or just fighting.
War does not solve things.
It's awful. Oh, yeah.
Occasionally, we must resort to war if there's like aggression, against us. But in a democracy, democratic procedures are a substitute for resorting to violence.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I was using that word. I should clarify. When I said war, I did not mean physical violence. I meant people shouting matches rather than real dialogue, and that's what I liked about your.
But that's also anti-democratic,
right?
Like the idea that you just shout your opponent down, or bully or shame them into retreating from
discussion.
The discussion. That's appalling. That's deeply anti-democratic.
Why is that so attractive to so many people? Aren't you worried? It seems like a kind of a sickness that society's in, that people think that's a good thing, and I don't know. It stirs me.
Yeah, so we see this kind of toxicity on both the left and the right.
Yeah.
The right is always complaining about cancel culture.
Huh.
But, the right also engages in a lot of cancel culture. Both sides are doing it. And I'm not claiming that they're all exactly equal.
Right.
But what I am saying is everybody has to look at their own behavior carefully and consider whether their contribution to the discussion is constructive or destructive of the possibility of living at peace with one another.
Yeah.
And coming to terms with the problems that we face together in a way that accommodates everyone's interests. Or if you just insist, I'm going to have my way and that's it, and I'm just going to steamroll over the opposition. Those are two very different ideas.
I guess that's a key word for you, is everyone, isn't it? Or everybody, right? It's important to you, right? Yeah.
Now, of course, that raises the deep question of global justice.
Yes, it does.
Because the democratic formations that democracy can be scaled, but we have never really figured out how to scale it to the whole world, and whether that's even feasible. We can scale it up to state level.
Yeah.
But even when you get to multi-state formations like the European Union, the democratic content of the EU is pretty weak.
Yeah.
There are too many layers removed from, decision making is too many layers removed from the actual level of experience and what people are confronting in their lives. It's very, very difficult to figure out how to scale these things, but and so that, I think, I'm not precluding the possibility of scaling, but I think that requires massive experimentation. We've barely even begun trying to figure out what that might look like. But we do face, with climate change, that's a global problem. It takes every hand on deck, and we really, do we have to coordinate really fast across international borders, and I'm not sure whether we'll make it.
Wow. So does that mean, is that part of your critique of consequentialism? Is that consequentialism starts from a weird place, presuming that we can just sort of scale things up? Is that a fair question? Or
I think, I think the problem with consequentialism is because it's so result focused.
Yeah.
It doesn't consider, in the way I think is necessary, how we are regarding people in our relentless drive for certain consequences. But that always has to be part of the equation.
Absolutely.
And that means that process matters. Right? And respect and human rights matter deeply, and constrain what we can permissibly do to achieve certain outcomes that are also, vital. And consequentialism doesn't really have a great way to think about that.
Yeah, I mean, but is that is that flaw in consequentialism connected with this problem of trying to, govern from a world? Is that one of the problems, or is that those are separate issues? I guess is what I was wondering.
Well, I do think that once you take democracy really, really seriously,
mm-hmm.
you already acknowledge limits to a purely consequentialist view.
Okay.
Because, and this is, it's coming straight out of Dewey.
It
that
does,
means and ends are not strictly separated.
No.
That it's not just achieving some end result, but the means you take have values of their own.
Mm-hmm.
Especially since so many of those means are, affected through human agency. So we're talking about how we treat other human beings, our fellow human beings. They're not just instruments in our hands.
Right. So everything is relational, is relationship, I guess is what.
Exactly. Yes. I deeply believe that.
Yes.
Right. And so when we think ethically and when we think in terms of political economy, we always have to think about how institutions are setting up our relationships to one another.
How do you, I guess so. Even this has been a great discussion. I've really enjoyed it immensely, and I wish it could go on forever, but it can, of course. So what do you see going forward in terms of the future of some of these questions, or what comes to your mind as we begin to conclude this episode, or anything you want to talk about comes to your mind?
Well, just when we think about, let me just stress another aspect of my work, which we haven't touched on.
Oh,
and
boy.
It is all about relationships, and in particular, relations of equality.
Okay.
So my theory of egalitarianism is all about how we create a society of equals, a free society of equals. Right, where we actually interact with one another on terms of equality.
Yes.
And in the history of political economy, equality has always been deeply tied both to relations of mutual respect and reciprocity, and also relations of sympathy with one another.
Ah, yes.
And if we look at the crisis of democracy today, they're deeply tied to the fact that when we view each other as enemies, we both think that and behave like we don't respect these other people and we have no sympathy for them. So who cares, what happens to them? And that is deeply anti-democratic. It's deeply inegalitarian. It leads people to a kind of authoritarian mindset. Well, I just have to impose my will on these unreasonable, horrible people, right? And both sides are thinking that way sometimes. It's tempted.
Yeah, it's really to me it's actually frightening. I know that how do we get out of this? I mean, I guess you're trying to find a course, and you're thinking to, but talk even further about that, because that interests me.
I think that one place to start is there's a lot of panic about the other side. And that's not to deny, look, there are some serious people who really want some kind of authoritarian regime as an end.
They do.
Right? So if you look at the January 6th insurrectionists, well, they just wanted totally their way. But in fact, it's wrong to stereotype every member of a political party in those terms. In fact, the vast majority of people who are affiliated with one party or the other in the big democracies are not that ruthless and fanatical. And in fact, we share a lot of common interests. And that means that we need to seek out common ground. And we do now have a kind of toxified spaces of discourse, particularly on social media, which are whipping up conspiracy theories whose whole point is to represent the other side as too evil to trust and frightening and so forth. And that, of course, destroys any prospect of talking with each other in ways to find common ground. However, we can create spaces in which it's possible for citizens to do that.
Right.
And in fact, if we look at one of the promising things that's happening in democracies around the world is the rise of citizens' assemblies.
Right.
And what we find is if you get the trolls out of the room and both politicians and media people who want to whip up distrust and discord, if you get those people out of the room, ordinary citizens of different political affiliations and walks of life and different racial identities are perfectly capable and have shown this repeatedly of having a constructive conversation about the problems that we confront and coming up with pretty reasonable solutions. And this has been shown all over the world in the democracies that ordinary citizens, you know, who don't have political careers in the sense of aspirations to office holding,
right,
really want to like figure out solutions to problems and not just whip up discord and distrust, you know, to win political office so they could be somebody important.
Well, you said something very interesting. You said that fear is the root, I guess, vice, and that you said hatred is derivative of fear psychologically. I think am I quoting you accurately?
That's actually coming straight out of another of my teachers from graduate school, Martha Nussbaum.
Ah, Martha.
She was at Harvard at the time.
You study with Nussbaum.
And so her wonderful book, The Monarchy of Fear, is articulating that thesis.
Thank you. I appreciate you mentioning her.
I do have an amendment to it because I don't think fear is the only driver. I do agree that fear is one of the drivers of an authoritarian, anti-democratic politics, but I think there's another driver that's equally important.
Okay.
And that's the one that Rousseau identified.
Interesting.
And that is esteem competition, group esteem competition. That is a kind of touchiness that what the other side is saying is just trying to put you down for who you are, for your social identity. And we see this erupting all over the place with all kinds of toxic discourse that surrounds issues of racial identities and religious identities, right? But various identities that divide us.
Yes.
Right. And so once people start hearing what other people are saying as just an attempt to insult them or make them feel bad about themselves, right, then we also can't get anything done because then what people do is then they rise to the defense of their identities because they don't want to be shamed in front of others. So that esteem competition in the sense that my group can succeed only by putting another group down is also a really important source of toxic discourse in society today.
So for you, envy, I'm sorry, it's fear, but also would you call this loss of dignity or so a kind of a perceived...
Yes, that's right. People are rising in defense of their dignity.
Yeah.
Now, I hasten to add that in many cases, the interpretation of what the other side is saying is just an attempt to put them down is itself a grave moral error.
Interesting.
So we can see this in all of the toxicity around the pandemic response.
Yeah, talk about that because we just lived through this incredible year. And
so, why do we see people getting upset when they're told on an airline to put on their mask? Or why do we see, there are these videos of people who are even like aggressively tearing the masks off of other people or getting into arguments?
It's insane.
And here's a case where I think President Trump during the pandemic modeled this kind of behavior for his supporters because he repeatedly interpreted virtually every public health measure dealing with scientifically based public health measure dealing with the pandemic as an attempt to make him look bad.
Yeah.
Right. So he complained that, why are we doing all of this testing? Because that increases the number of confirmed cases and that makes me look bad.
Oh, God.
Right.
Yeah.
and why did he say, oh, the pandemic is nothing. It's a little bitty virus, no worse than the flu, because he wanted to minimize how bad things were so that he wouldn't look like he was incompetent in failing to deal with it. Or why did he insist that the governors praise him if he sent them personal protective equipment, right? Because it was all about his status and esteem before others. So they had to praise him, right? It was all about how, his appearance before others, about esteem.
Yeah.
And, many of his followers learned from him
to behave that
way. If, liberals or whatever are wearing masks, that this is just, it's nothing more than a negative judgment. They're just parading their negative judgment of conservatives, right? About basically they're interpreting mask wearing not as a public health measure, but rather as the smugness of those liberals who are shaming us and trying to guilt us into wearing masks, which are useless and possibly even dangerous to health. And no wonder they're tearing off other people's masks and coughing in their faces to show that they're not going to take it anymore because, right, everything is interpreted as a chip on the shoulder, right? You're just trying to insult me, right? And if you read the other side exclusively in those terms, then you can get pretty short-tempered and toxic, rising in defense of your own identity. And that's basically what we see endlessly repeated in YouTube videos over masks.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's really tragic because we're talking about microorganisms that can hurt you. And there's nothing more.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, there's nothing more. Well, hold that thought. What I want to say about that is that if there's anything that's indiscriminate in anything, I mean, it has nothing to do with who you are or what kind of person you are. That doesn't discriminate. Or viruses and germs. I mean, it just seems to me it's very tragic. I mean, I'm sorry.
It is awful, but let's keep in mind that, conservatives who are arguing over pandemic health measures, they have their own points which have to be taken seriously. I do think that children have been pretty seriously disturbed by remote learning.
Oh, yeah.
Little kids cannot learn online. I'm sorry.
Yeah, they can't. It's been a nightmare. For them.
It's been a nightmare for the parents too.
Yep.
And you might have come across this incredibly interesting article in the New York Times in which they showed a photograph of children learning during the pandemic of 1918.
Wow.
And they decided to hold classes outdoors. And they showed these kids bundled up in the wintertime in New York City with desks, and they're learning. And, I always thought, while it was happening, while the schools were being shut down, here I am living in Ann Arbor.
Yeah.
And I really wondered, why didn't the public school teachers consider the possibility of outdoor learning?
Yeah.
And even if it wasn't, every weekday, to have some classes where the kids could be running around and playing and exchanging ideas with each other. And it wouldn't eliminate all transmission, but in fact, it wasn't long before people were realizing that transmission wasn't really all that high outdoors, and that kids seemed to be less bad. Little kids weren't as infective as teens and adults. I just think that we should have been more creative in thinking about the education of children. And even if you don't go all the way to red state strategies, which of course have their own problems. If we had actually been working this out democratically rather than arguing that the other side's evil and arrogant and smug, then maybe we could have come up with creative compromises that gave due room for both the protection of health and the education of children.
Wow. Well, that brings us right up to the current moment. Where do you see going forward that your own philosophical work? The truth that it seems to me that freedom and equality can go together, right? There's not a necessary.
Absolutely.
So I wanted. This is
of my work.
Well, this is Isaiah Berlin's great error, I think. As much as I love Berlin, and I've written about him and how he much influenced it, this is what he gets wrong, right? He didn't see the harmony, potential harmony, right, between equality and freedom. Do you want to talk a little bit before we conclude about that, because that's a perennial debate in philosophy?
Well, yes. Yeah. And so, remember, on my view, equality is fundamentally about how we relate to one another.
Yes.
And only secondarily, not unimportantly, but only derivatively, how much money each of us have in our pocket.
Right, of course, sure.
I mean, of course, that distributive justice is super important, but I do think that it is subordinate to the question of how we relate to each other. Now, if you have massive inequalities of wealth, it's very difficult for people on opposite sides of that to relate to each other as equals, because the rich person can pretty much dictate terms and really operates under no constraints.
Right.
You know, just look at how difficult it is to bring billionaires to any kind of legal account at all for illegal behavior. It's like very, very hard to do that. Occasionally, you know, they can do it, but basically the differential resources between a billionaire and even the Department of Justice are so huge that it almost never happens.
Yeah.
So, but if we think about how we relate to each other as equals, there is actually a deep conceptual overlap between equality and freedom.
Absolutely.
So think of it in negative terms.
Mm-hmm.
A fundamental way to be unfree is to be subject to the domination of another person.
Yes.
But domination is a relation of inequality.
Absolutely.
So to be free, you have to be free of domination. And that requires that you stand in some fundamental relation of equality to others, so they can't just order you around.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's
in an unaccountable fashion.
Well, that's a case where one follows from the other. So there's a symbiotic, there's a natural harmony between the two, right? Because I mean, if you and I are both talking on this podcast, we're free beings talking to each other, right? And so so the possibility, so the very I guess how I would put it is that the very possibility of conversation opens up many, many possibilities, right? Dialogue itself.
I agree.
Yes.
Yes. And that was a really deep theme of Dewey's.
Yes.
So my favorite essay of Dewey's is an op-ed that he wrote in 1939, I think.
Wow.
Called Creative Democracy, The Task Before Us.
Yes, I've read that.
And I want to stress the creative part.
Yep.
When we talk to each other as equals, share our experiences, and search for common interests, those are all creative acts.
Yes, they are.
Because each of us comes to re-articulate our sense of ourselves, our needs, and our interests in response to the other party, so that we can construct something in common to move forward together when we face some common problems like, climate change. Mm-hmm. It's a very creative process. Interests are not fixed.
No, they're not. They're not fixed, and because they flow, right? They're durational. They occur over time, right? They're not like little blocks.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And we're constantly, reconstructing our sense of our interests through interaction with other people.
Yeah. And I guess that's what people that are too abstract miss, right? They don't see. I mean, I love the opening. I think it's one of your more recent books, the one you sent me that I loved. And of course, towards the end, you said we have to roll up our sleeves and do work. We have a lot of work to do. And I guess you were thinking about.
That's my work ethic book, yeah.
Right, but no, that's an interesting. And I thought about, of course, the biosphere and climate change, and boy, do we, that isn't like We certainly do.
That is the biggest problem that humanity has ever faced. Yeah, we have a lot of work cut out for us, right? We got to get to.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess that maybe is where we should end. So talk more about how you see that, or the role of work. Do you see possibilities for? I remember an anarchist friend of mine, John Clark, says that when he said a lot of disputes. He was a philosopher. He said sometimes it's people asking for too little, rather than we think it's like people asking for too much, but actually. Do you think he's right about this sort of? I guess I don't know if that. I don't know if that makes sense.
But something that I do believe about dealing with climate change.
Yeah.
Is that a vastly better world than our current world?
Yep.
Is in our grasp.
Yes.
So the cost of alternative energy is dropping incredibly rapidly.
Mm-hmm.
And to switch over would actually dramatically reduce people's energy bills.
Yep.
And dramatically reduce other kinds of pollution besides carbon.
Yeah.
So I actually have an electric vehicle.
Yeah.
And I plug it into my home outlet. It doesn't smell. There's no smelly gasoline. I never have to change the oil. It's essentially a zero maintenance vehicle. I mean, yeah, you got to rotate the tires, but you know
That's
what I mean?
Funny.
The beauty of an electronic vehicle is that an electric motor is an unbelievably simple thing compared to an internal combustion engine. It doesn't require, there's not nearly as many moving parts.
Mm-hmm.
And so far fewer things break down.
Yep.
And you don't need a catalytic converter. There's no pollution. I've got solar panels on my roof, so, the energy is green to recharge it. It's fantastic. And with advanced battery technology, the range anxiety is also, a solved problem. We do have to spread rechargers all across the country. That's the major bottleneck now, I think, for widespread adoption. But it's going to be a much better. They're also fun to drive, by the way.
That's interesting.
Much more responsive and great acceleration. So
you're living.
Why not go for it?
So you're actually living in your daily life part of the solution. That's right. That's, if you think about it, you're saying, well, I'm doing
We're
this.
We're moving in that direction. We do use some natural gas in our house. So we are looking at heat pumps and so forth. So we're in the process of transitioning, but yeah, we're moving in that direction. And of course, my husband and I, double incomes, we're in a very privileged position. We do have to roll out, on a global scale, modes of financing.
Yeah.
So that absolutely everyone can participate. But it's not as if we can't invent institutions that enable a transition for everyone.
Right.
Then everyone will be better off. Well, we have to create those institutions.
We do. That's why I quoted John Clark. John Clark, when he's talking about asking for too little, I think he's critiquing zero sum. A zero-sum scarcity.
Absolutely. Zero-sum is completely wrong.
Yeah.
And indeed, this is one of the lessons we can learn from proponents of markets, right? I mean, at the core of any well-functioning market is that both sides gain.
Yep.
Now, of course, there's a lot of dysfunctional markets where only one side is gaining and the other side is scammed or duped or coerced into something which, that puts them down on a escalator down to the bottom. But well-designed markets are such that both sides gain in every transaction. And that's what you want. And it's possible, but it requires careful design.
Yeah. I think I hope you think that's a great place to conclude, because there's a hopefulness there. And I really want to thank you for your generosity. And,
it's been a pleasure talking with you.
Yes. I mean, even though this is an arts podcast, I have a very broad definition of aesthetics and certainly philosophy, and John Rawls and Martha Nussbaum are important writers, and you follow in their tradition. And so it's, to me, most important you've been on our podcast. So I thank you immensely for this opportunity.
Well, it's been a pleasure talking with you, and I'm very happy to have been invited. Thank you.
Thank you. and have a safe and good week in your future intellectual work and endeavors.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I don't like goodbyes, so I'll see you soon, folks. Thank you.